throughout. I will randomly point at people and drag you in as if, you know, your student's not paying attention, because I want to have a conversation. I want to hear your stories and your input as well. Feel free to jump in and say, hey, you know, that's bullshit, or I want to know some more about that. That's totally cool. If we don't get through the slides, who cares? It'll be more interesting, so feel free. Is this actually working? No, it's not. All right, we'll do it this way. So as I mentioned, things are old in business, but in the IEEE world, in our world, it's well known that using open source in business makes sense. The trick is that we're still at the, well, we can save money doing it when we talk about startups using open source. Yeah, instead of paying $500 for Microsoft Office, I can go download LibreOffice or OpenOffice. It's going to save me a bunch of money. Everybody understands that. So if you look at which companies are adopting open source products the fastest, it's definitely startups, and it makes perfect sense. They don't have the cash. That's interesting, but it's not so interesting because it's old. You can see we were talking about that more than 10 years ago. So I want to see what else is out there. And we know that there's a lot of money to be made with open source. An IDC review suggested that by next year, we're going to hit $8.1 billion in the market for open source products and services, and that it's compounding annually at a ridiculous rate, which means there's more and more and more money to be made in this arena. Now, how are you going to make that money? That's the interesting question. You'll note the title of my presentation today is Born Open Businesses. I think born open businesses are unique. They are different from businesses that use open source, or even businesses that leverage open source. Born open businesses are those businesses whose model is built around and dependent on a system of production that brings together participants inside and outside the business to produce something that is available to everyone. And if you think about that for a second, that's a broader definition than most people apply to just open source alone. That goes into other areas, such as talking about Creative Commons, talking about Wikipedia, and even talking about what's going on in very distant areas like open architecture, the buildings that they're making, and stuff like that. It's a broad phenomenon, and I think it's really interesting to see how that relates to entrepreneurship specifically. So that's why I'm talking about that today. Our friends at NextJ at Seneca do some really interesting stuff, and I was talking with one of their guys last night about their strategy. He said, well, what does born open mean? And I explained to him. He said, well, so NextJ isn't born open. I said, no, it isn't. But that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not, it's maybe not what an entrepreneur today can start like this and grow using this model. So it's a different model. Born open businesses are different because they break a number of the rules in the business literature, in what business academics are talking about. They like to talk about markets, which are any forces that you can motivate someone to give you something for money, effectively. Currency, rules, and price determines everything. Everything's embedded in the price. Hierarchies, which are your traditional businesses where someone tells someone else what to do and pays them to do that for them. And then whatever they get out of that, they keep. That's the hierarchy model. And networks, which are reasonably recent, are these connections where people have a position, and depending where you are in the network, you might be able to do certain things that other people can't do. There might be exchanges, reciprocity, that kind of stuff. Born open businesses break the rules for all three of these systems, and so nobody knows how to categorize them. And they're just starting right now at Harvard and Stanford, some of the guys over there, to start talking about this. I was at the Academy of Management Conference in Boston in August, and they're starting to hash this out. You know, what are we going to do with these businesses because they don't fit? So that's why I think they're an interesting topic to look at. So this is a little bit what we're going to talk about. I want to talk about who becomes an entrepreneur in born open businesses, what the process looks like, how you become successful, how you grow. And then we'll look at the most important part of the process, and finally what the business model looks like. So what makes an entrepreneur? According to old entrepreneurship literature, there are 8 archetypes of entrepreneurs which talk about the the prototypical characteristics that they have. Nobody ever fits into one archetype. They're always bits and pieces of different archetypes together. But it's an interesting exercise to look at the types to get a sense of what's out there. They vary based on personal characteristics, abilities, skills. They vary based on motivations. And they also vary based on the strategies and organizational structures that they use when they start their businesses, and the environment that they position themselves in and the kind of activities that they pursue in those environments. Oh, nice. The first type is the escape artist. This is the person who gets really pissed off at what they've been doing for 20 years and say, screw this, and they go and they get a Tim Hortons franchise. They do something completely different to get away from the monotony of their existing world. Their work is not challenging, or it's unrewarding, or salaries are too low, or there's no promotion opportunities. They just want to get away. What's key here is that they're changing industries. They are not applying any of their existing skills. A second prototype is the deal maker. Deal makers are good at bringing people together. They know how to arrange the relationships between suppliers, wholesalers, retailers, and customers, because arranging those things, for those of you guys who are involved in business, as you know, is incredibly complex and is a talent of its own. So you can actually base your entrepreneurial activities around being really good at doing that. You have to have a lot of contacts, and you have to maybe be a little bit extroverted. There's an interesting discussion in the book, Quiet. I don't know if you've heard this book about introverts and how they relate to open source. And not a lot of introverts like being deal makers. They prefer to work on other stuff. And there's some interesting insights in that book. So check it out. Even in the popular press, you can hear about it. Another type is the subject matter expert. This person worked before in a position where some technical skills and experience were required, and they're the same as the new business that they go to and create. The skills of the founders are key for the success of the business. There's not a lot of focus on selling or marketing or advertising or the stuff that some businesses do, and instead they develop their customers based on previous referrals or based on having being well known for their expertise. They compete by offering better services than generic firms who don't have that in-depth expertise in a specific area. And as we'll see, this is a model that tends to work very well with people involved in born open businesses. Another type is the purchaser, who goes out and buys a company and says, you're not doing too well, I can do it better, I'm going to fix what's wrong with your company, spend a lot of time figuring out what's wrong, reevaluate it, and then offer something new that's going to work better. A fifth type is the scanner. This person is very good at looking at the market, the environment, and figuring out what is going to change and when. They focus on selling products that are ahead of the market shift before something is going to change. And that makes it really relevant to technology companies. If you look at the oil and gas industry, it's not too often that you discover a huge brand new oil reserve. So shifts don't happen very frequently, but in technology, it's crazy. So scanners can be very successful entrepreneurs. There's the insider that's focused on consulting in a niche specialization. What's different from the insider and the subject matter expert is that they know the right people in a particular industry, not a general value chain. And they know who are the people who award the contracts. So these are the guys who have inside connections in government. They know, okay, Department of National Defense is going to spend $5 million on upgrading their website. I had beer with Johnny and Billy last week. I know that I can bid on this contract and be successful. That is a talent, and you can build your business around this. But it's not for everyone because it requires certain skills. It requires developing contacts as well. This person tends to develop leads for himself and the rest of the company in consulting services. It's not so technical focused. So the person who is the insider typically isn't the same person writing the code. There's the inventor. The inventor comes up with new ideas or products or services in the traditional way, the alternating windshield wipers. And their advantage as entrepreneurs is they're the first to market. They're the first movers, and it takes other companies time to catch up. You get some interesting questions about intellectual property, intellectual resources here, and whether they can really compete with big companies. Yes? Scanner. So the scanner looks at the market and makes a decision based on the market. This person looks at their navel and makes a decision based on their navel. That's the difference. So if you look at the last line, the trick is finding customers for the product and service, because you've created this awesome thing, but you have no idea if anybody wants it. Whereas the scanner knows that somebody wants something but hasn't created it yet. And believe me, those create entirely different models. Also, for asking the first question, you win the first prize today. Did you know there were prizes? Congratulations, courtesy of Asus, a mouse pad for you. Now everybody wants to ask questions, you know. And the final type is the creative organizer. So this person methodically, I need more coffee, plans and organizes the acquiring of the necessary skills and performs the task of implementing the business. So this is maybe people like you. I might want to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to go to this talk where I can learn how to be an entrepreneur. No. Okay, so step 1, I do this. Step 2, I do this. What do I not know? Well, I don't know this. I'm going to go to the library and take out a book and do that. And then when you put the business together, you do it very carefully and methodically. That can be very successful as well, because entrepreneurship is crazy and there's a lot of chaos. And people who can do this well help stabilize it and make it reproducible. When there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of luck, and it can be harder to figure out what you did right and what you did wrong. The creative organizer knows exactly what works and how to reproduce it. So those are the archetypes. What you find, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a second, is that born open entrepreneurs tend to be, not always, they tend to be subject matter experts, they tend to be scanners, and they tend to be insiders. Why? Because these specific things connect them to the ability to do it for a living. The other things, the other archetypes make it a little bit more difficult with the born open model to do it for a living. And this is where we get into the how can you give it away and still make a living. These guys have inherent things that the other types don't to do that. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. So what's the process already? You guys are sitting there taking notes. Yeah, I want to make $1 million. Come on, tell me how to do it. So, if we look at the literature, what's out there already? There's a whole slew of things. The traditional model was the Venkatraman model, which talks about opportunity. They say an entrepreneur comes along and they have some sort of unique information or perspective that someone else doesn't have. And the reason the literature figures you must have that is because if you don't have that, how are you different? Why can't anybody just do what you're doing? If there's some reason that you are going to be the entrepreneur, that's going to be the focus, then you must have something that other people don't have. For those of you who have a background in economics, I don't know if anybody does. Does anybody have a background in economics? Sort of. What does that translate to? Undergrad. What does that translate to? It's saying that we have a market that is inherently waves that normalizes over time through competition. And that if there isn't something unique and distinct, you just get competed into, commodities, and it's not interesting anymore. It's the old economics way of thinking, and that's how all the business literature is based upon. Open entrepreneurship, that you can do something that you sustain without, production, it's 1,000 years away. The next thing that happens when you have this information is that it leads you to identifying an opportunity. So the information is here, maybe you have a unique perspective here, and you go, oh, wow, if I put this together, I could do X. And what X is entirely context dependent. It's based on the information that you have in your unique framing. Your unique framing might be your graduate work. Oh, yeah, I invented this really cool thing, or I found this algorithm, or I read this paper that, talked about an expired patent from 50 years ago. Here's an opportunity. And once you recognize this opportunity, you make a company, you go and you experiment by selling products, seeing if customers don't want it, or if they do want it, which is the market forces, cash exchange for something. And based on the market forces, you're either a success or you adapt and fix your product so that it's what people want to give you money for. And you loop this until you either crash and burn because you run out of money or you make $1 billion. That's the traditional model, and it's really that simple. But that's the problem. It's not a really good map to reality. It's a great model for thoughts, but who has ever run a business this simply? It never happens that easily. when we talk about open source, they've extended the model a little bit. Not talking about open source, but talking about what they say they call user entrepreneurship. And this is where they say the model's actually bigger. You can get your users involved. So already this is implying that you are a company and you have users. If you're starting up, how do you have users? So it's a bit confusing, but that's how they do it. And they say there's a user's unmet needs. They go over here and they experiment and create a novel solution that satisfies those needs. And they share that with the community, and there's some sort of public interaction that gives them feedback. And then when it's really, 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 really good and we know that it's useful, then that's the opportunity. Then when they go into the market process, putting together the opportunity that they have from the development of the user's unmet needs, the information asymmetry, and the unique framing, they're going to be a success. They form the company, they enter into commercial market space, and they adapt a little bit further, but the probability of failure is lower because they already have something over here that they know that users want. You can also interpret it this differently in that you're the user. You're not a company, you're this one guy who's found a need in something that you do, and you experiment with that need before you go towards identifying opportunities. And that's the way I prefer to interpret it because I think that makes more sense in the context of open entrepreneurship. But there's still a problem here. You just hit the market, and then that's it. So how do you grow? How do you know if you're really a success? How do you negotiate that ongoing? It can't just stop here. So I had a problem with this model, and I'm like, there's got to be something more out there. And this is what academics do. They stand on each other's shoulders and say, nah, that wasn't good enough. I want to go further. So this is where my research comes in. I'd been talking with people, and I'd spent a lot of time working in various places involved in open source and starting my own companies, and I saw that there was something else going on. It seems like that there were more steps and connections, and I wanted to investigate myself. So I started doing research here at Schulich, and I've been doing interviews. Why interviews? Because when you don't know a lot about a phenomenon, you can't just go out there and statistically analyze a database, because you don't know what you're looking for. So interviews are a really good way to get rich information where someone else tells you what to look for. It's a little bit lazy, but believe me, it's a lot of work. So I've interviewed about 35 people to date. I'm constantly scheduling people, and this is where I make my pitch that I'd like everyone here to volunteer to be interviewed for my research. Why? Because I think you guys have the best stories to tell. And if anybody thinks I'm not crazy and goes, yeah, I'd like to be interviewed, I happen to have, by coincidence, a sign-up sheet right here. So just put your name and your email address, and I'll email you, and later on, you can be interviewed by me and tell me your really cool stories. Thank you in advance. No obligation, though. I know I appear a little crazy. So these people who were involved in the research represented a broad cross-section of free and open source projects. For the protection of my interviewees, I anonymize all of the company names and the names of the interviewees. It's quite comical, you'll see in a second. So I don't even actually talk about the companies, but if you can think of a large open source company or some of the smaller companies that leverage the larger projects, I've interviewed people across all of those cross sections. Lots of friends in Toronto, so all the companies that are represented in Toronto I've talked to, and a lot of the companies that are represented in Ottawa I've talked to. And even people in the US. So there's a pretty good cross-section, but it could always be bigger. There's always projects doing different interesting things. I was hearing about a project at McMaster doing medical records last night that appears to be a novel open source model, that it's different from other open source models. So maybe I'll write a new paper on that someday. I did interviews in person, by phone, via Skype, and even on IRC. I thought it was an interesting idea. You do this sort of asynchronous interviewing via IRC while you're working for programmers. That works really well. So the interviews were 30 minutes to over 3 hours in some cases. Had some wonderful, wonderful conversations. The interviews are currently being transcribed so that I can analyze them. I've got about a third of them transcribed to date. Yes, sir. That is an excellent question. When I chose people to interview, you get a prize, sir. I explicitly used a definition of open source that was very, very broad. So the reason I did that was because as we're talking about, the models are shifting continuously, and we know software works, but what's going on in all these other spaces. So the definition that I used included whatever the interviewee thought open source meant to them. And in some cases, that was very far. So one person I interviewed thought that open source meant anything that is public on the internet. And he was talking about information in terms of security analysis and research. And he said, when you're doing security research for governments, there's closed source and open source information. And open source information is whatever you can get without a security clearance. I said, that's a really strange definition of open source. But he made an interesting pitch for that. And the model that he was using and how they were cooperatively collaborating to develop these security reports was not so different than how we develop open source software. So he was a perfect candidate. So that's a really good question. And I think there's room for more. The problem is that when you're trying to make an argument about open source entrepreneurship, you have to target entrepreneurs. And so I went a little bit broadly around what is entrepreneurship, and we'll see that in a second too. So, still more prizes to get if people have other questions.
That definition of open source is quite common in the intelligence community.
Is it?
Oh, very much.
I had never been exposed to it, so.
Well, like in the CIA, there's probably a division that just works on open source intelligence.
Well, there you
But
go.
it is different than software, though.
It is. But one of the papers I'm working on is what do we do with all the definitions? So we've got open source, we've got open innovation, we've got crowdsourcing, we've got free software, we've got open collaboration, we've got peer production, we've got, what do we do with them? Where do they overlap? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? This is one of the papers I'm working on because it's confusing. There's a lot of stuff out there and it's hard to follow. And I think my batteries are dying. All right, I'm going to stop using this. Okay. One other thing I did is I did a small panel study where I sat down a bunch of people over beer at an open source gathering in Ottawa, and we just talked. I bought everybody beer and nachos, which makes them really happy, and I recorded it and got all their interview release forms, and then we talked about FLOSS community. What does that mean? And I got some really interesting data out of that as well. I'm also going to do empirical analysis of large databases such as the Bugzilla databases that are out there, but that's future research. That's not related to this. So who are some of the people I interviewed? Well, Boyd Langton was a really interesting guy, and you get bonus points and a prize if you figure out the criteria I used for my naming scheme. His primary project was the Rawson project. His educational background was economics. So we do have people involved in economics. No, it wasn't him, by the way. I didn't mean to suggest it was. He encountered FLOSS for the first time working for a large company that is doing stuff. And his project involvement today is really, really high. And he mostly fits the model of an insider. So he has bits of subject matter expert, but he's the guy who figures out how to negotiate the contract. So that's one person that I interviewed. Another person was Topher Brink. His primary project was the Epitaph, which was his business, that works around a project that I call Dark Horse, which is a large open source project that does web stuff that lots of people are involved in. And so he's involved in sort of two projects. One is his business, and one is this open source project at large. It's interesting to see the dualities there. His background is journalism. He taught himself programming using FLOSS tools. And his project involvement today is about average. It's not super, super huge. He's mostly a scanner, but a bit of an escape artist, too, because he did change industries. And then there's Paul Ballard, who his primary project is Tabula Rasa, which is his company. And again, the Dark Horse project is his major project he's involved in. His educational background is political science. And he had exposure to internet technologies at nonprofits that he worked for. Today, his project involvement is pretty low. He likes to oversee what's going on and hires people in to do work for him. So he's a bit more of a creative organizer. He really meticulously figured out how he was going to start this born open business and where it was going to go with it. Yeah, he's also a bit of an insider. He's pretty good at getting those projects, figuring out where they're going. So this just gives you an idea of the diversity of some of the people I interviewed. Oh, I jumped forward. Okay, so are you ready for the steps? People always like, okay, I want step 1, step 2, because we're all engineer, computer scientists. We think that way. So disclaimer, don't sue me if these steps don't work, but I did throw something together so that we can talk about it. And I invite you to talk about the steps as we go. We still have a fair amount of time. So what I learned from the interviews was I got all this information, and people love to talk about the details of this bug that they're filing and, the extensions and all this, and they get really technical. But if you look at the narrative of all the interviews that I did, they all started to converge. People started from distinct backgrounds, economics, political science, journalism, and they all started moving like this towards a very similar business model. I started hearing the same things over and over and over. And each one of them thinks that it's unique. Maybe not. Some of them know that it's not. But they all hashed their way through the same steps without knowing what the steps were. They just sort of tripped down the stairs as they were going, picked themselves up, tripped again, until they found something that worked. And what I've done is I've distilled this into steps so that you guys can trip a little less when you're doing it. You might trip a little more, maybe because the environment's changed. Who knows? We'll see. But this is what was coming out of the research, and I think it's really interesting. So step one was identify a need. We know this. This is obvious. When you start a business, you have to know what you're doing. And this is where the difference between someone who's product-focused and someone who's customer-focused comes in. It's really hard to start a business if you're product-focused, but we tend to do that. So these people always found a need first. That's what they tended to do. Usually it was a personal annoyance in a routine activity that they were doing themselves. One person, well, I'll show you some quotes in a second, could be an inefficiency or something that a client asked them to do, and they're like, how am I going to do it? And they got involved in something that became bigger than just that immediate need. It could also be a research question. It does come out of grad school a lot. You'd be surprised how many people come out of universities and form these businesses. And the open source model fits really nicely with the university academic model, so it's a natural fit for people. So one example of someone telling me about this, the problem was that at this point in time, there was no way, short of opening the door and hollering into the operating room theater, to know how the previous operation was going. This was approximately, at the time of the story, was about the year 2000. Can you imagine in the year 2000, just a little bit more than 10 years ago, we still didn't have anything other than shouting in this particular operating room context. Isn't that mind-boggling? I was like, what? I thought people had all these things. He's like, no. He also said to me, we had thrown $100,000 into a commercial solution to address this problem, and it still wasn't working. So we had all this equipment just sitting in the operating room doing absolutely nothing. This was the motivation to get involved into an open source project and to find an open source solution that later led to developing a business. Another person I interviewed said, I was gaming with some buddies, and we just needed voice chat. I mean, one person lived here, one person lived here. We were university buddies. We needed to game. We needed to get our kills in, I had to figure out a solution for that. That was the motivation. Later on, that turned into a lifelong business. The motivations do not have to be entrepreneurial. They just have to be an itch, something that's irritating you. That's the starting point. The second step that came out was that everybody talked to one degree or another about a search. They said, I went out there and I looked at the internet at large to see if I could find a project that addressed my need so that I can be lazy, because we all want to be lazy. Why reinvent the wheel? Or a project that addressed 70% of my need and there was still a little bit of work that I had to do. The reason this step is important is because it gives you a clear understanding later on of what you can contribute to current offerings, which turns into what your clients want. It also saves you from reinventing the wheel. If you're absolutely certain that no project exists that remotely addresses the need, or that the only projects are maybe less than 50% of addressing your need, that's the context where you maybe want to create a new project. And we could have a whole talk about the criteria of when do you create a new project, when do you use an existing one, when do you fork it. That's a really difficult discussion. But as a basic criteria today, let's say if what's out there does not address 70% of your needs, you can start thinking about creating your own project. The reason is, if it does address 70% of your needs, the effort that you will put in to make it address your needs will be much lower than the effort that you will put in creating a new project and building a community around it. That is the intensive effort that you will have to do. So it is worth it to reuse what's out there. And open source is built on that. We're built on reuse. We're built on building upon stuff. As a sub-activity here, if you do start a project, you're still going to go out there and pull modules like this. It doesn't necessarily mean Linux from scratch where you're writing all the code and compiling everything. You can still grab pieces, but you might not join an existing community. So what did that look like? Well, I started looking around for software that addressed my need. And then, hey, look, I found this thing that was really interesting, and I got into it. And long after it addressed my need, I stayed involved in that project. I started to see if there was something that met at least 70% of my needs that I could build upon. That was what they were talking about. The third step is to build a structure to scratch the itch. So what do I mean by this? I mean, if you just address your needs, you've addressed your needs and nothing else. What's different in these steps that lead to entrepreneurship and what entrepreneurs do to build their businesses is that they build some sort of structure around addressing that need. Maybe it's making it reproducible. Maybe it's that they invest a lot of time in learning about the particular project so that they become a bit of an expert in it. It may also be that they build something extended in the case that they're adding that extra 30%. And it may also be making it understandable to others so that others in a different context can use what you're doing. Either way, there's some sort of permanency to it. There's some sort of structure. There's something that allows it to continue to exist after that need has been addressed. So Topher Brink said we had a mechanism for embodying all the work that we were doing in Epitaph because it was open source. It wasn't a one-off system. So what he meant by open source in this context was it wasn't just, here's this thing that does this one thing and we're throwing it away and then we're never going to reuse it. It was a system that could be reused and adapted. That's how he chose to develop it. And this turned into a business. Adele DeWitt said, so I just did it. It worked out great. Before we knew, we had an almost completely automatic installation system for installations and upgrades. It was a pretty big deal. So the key word here is automatic. So there's a system behind this of making it happen that had to build up. If we were doing it just once, we'd just install an upgrade and walk away. Instead, he built a system around it, and that's what made it reproducible. Okay, so we know a lot of this stuff. How do you become successful? Where do the millions come in? Step 4 is where a lot of businesses stop, or excuse me, a lot of projects stop, and this is where they don't become businesses. So I got some contrasting examples as well, where people came to me and they said, I've done all this stuff, but I don't really want to take it onto a business. It's just a hobby. I want to keep it there. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but that's where there's an interesting divide between a hobby and an open business. Where the divide is when you start looking for more needs. Look for the needs of other stakeholders that you can address with the system that you've set up to scratch the initial itch. It can be an extension of the project, even more beyond the 70%, the 100% of what you're doing, which addresses new needs, or it can be addressing the same need with a different group of people. This is your standard model of business extension. New products, new markets. It's really that simple. And people tended to somehow do that. Oh, this was usable for this client over here when I was doing consulting. And this person came to me and said, well, I need to add this. What can I do? I looked for needs and I started addressing them more and more. So I realized that if you're a system administrator, there's a disconnect between the technologies that you would like to use and the ways by which you can effectively manage those technologies for your users. So this is a recognition of somebody else's need. I've designed, work with, and maintain a methodology for interorganizational organization. So this is another interesting extension of definition of open source. This person talks about open source as a methodology for interorganizational organization. That's what he talks about. And he applies it to IT, but he also applies it to sports. He applies it to transit. He applies it to government management and other systems like that. That's what open source means to him. And I think that's fascinating because he's found a model of models. He's really good at that. Step 5, you extract the value. Yay, you make the millions. That's where you get it from. And I want to have a discussion about this for a second. This is, in the language of Randy Posh, the first head nod. This is the first trick in my presentation. When I talk about extracting value, just like I'm moving past the definition of open source of software, I want to move past the definition of value as just getting all the monies. I think getting paid to do something as a consultant or whatever is the most basic level of extracting value. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I think we're missing out if we don't extend our definition of value and really understand the other ways that we can benefit from following these steps. So another way is you can get hired as an employee in a traditional hierarchy business and work as an open source entrepreneur, in quotes, within that company. There is absolutely nothing wrong with getting a salary as your business income. The only difference is the words that we're using. The point is money is coming in for you using a particular model. It's not about who's paying that money or where it's coming from. That's not what makes an entrepreneur. What makes an entrepreneur is someone who's self-sufficient, builds these steps, follows a particular approach. So like, if anybody thinks I'm crazy about that, I want to have a discussion about it because I think it's really important. And this came out in the interviews. I had a number of people who said to me, we'll come back to the slide in a second, I've never really had a resume. People would sometimes say, you're just doing great work as a volunteer, would you like to be paid to do it? And they just bring them into the company. I'd always be having people giving me these conversations. So what you get out of this is that you can be a successful open source entrepreneur by outliving the companies who pay your salary. This guy has worked for companies who hire him as an entrepreneur, pay him a whole lot of money, and take all of the risk on their shoulders. The business fails, he goes back to being a volunteer, and he goes and gets hired by another company who takes all the risk on their shoulders, pays him a truckload of money to do the work, and so on and so forth. That's not a lack of entrepreneurship. That's brilliant entrepreneurship. He's an entrepreneur who has figured out how to displace the risk on someone else. What could be smarter? Yes? Entrepreneurship is something different. I'll tell you what's different about entrepreneurship. You're right, there is a term called entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is when you work within a company and you have figured out how to gather resources in an entrepreneurial manner to move your way up within the company. So if you imagine the structure at Nortel, you're a project manager and you want to get to being a VP. How do you do that? Well, you got to show that you have worth. And you can show that you have worth within a company by using entrepreneurial skills to move up. That's different than being an employee who's going from company to company as those companies fail. That's not entrepreneurship because it's not one company and you're not building up. But you're assuming that the failure is based on your skill. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's not, because it's not your company. You're just an employee. And if you look at the market out there, being an employee who isn't driving the direction of the business can be an awesome thing. Because there's business types, not business types like me who understand open source, who think, yeah, we're going to make $1 bajillion, and they maybe foolishly pay some guy $100,000 or $200,000 a year to develop this thing that he can pull out of his pocket from an open source project in 5 minutes because they don't know any better. That's no different than a customer pulling dollars out and paying for something that you can pull off a project as a consultant really quickly. The only difference is that in the tax code, you have a different classification. The way you report your income tax is different. But if we don't call that entrepreneurship, and in the case of when we base it on open entrepreneurship, I think we're missing an opportunity for value. There is also entrepreneurship with open source, and that does exist, and I have talked to people within companies who do that, but it's a whole different talk, and I don't think it's as much related to the entrepreneurship type stuff we're talking about here. Let's go back to that slide for just 1 second and talk about the other types. So do not underestimate the value of creating contacts to leverage later. That is value. Contacts are value. People are value. Networks are value. Where you extract the money is different from whether or not you are creating value. That's really, really important. So don't underestimate other ways that you are building stuff up. For example, building a reputation, adding skills to a resume, becoming known as that guy. I'm known as that guy who does open source strategy research at York because I'm the only guy who does that. I feed into that brand by doing all kinds of things that cost me time and effort, and all I get out of it is the brand. But there's value there. I went and bugged the guys at Seneca and said, hey, you want a course in open source strategy for your students? Wouldn't that be awesome? And they said, yeah, I'm an open entrepreneur. My value is going to come out of getting paid a few bucks to teach a course on what I love to do already. There's nothing wrong with that. If I hadn't built up my reputation showing up to these talks for a number of years and building up my resume, I would never be able to make that pitch and do it. So the value that I'm going to extract from the salary from teaching is based on this reputation. If I skip this step and say, no, 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 I'm only getting reputation, I want cash, it becomes impossible. And you're missing an entire model. That's why it's so important. Likewise, some people do it in a not-for-profit model. Just because you're a not-for-profit does not make you any less of an entrepreneur. A perfectly valid model is to set up a not-for-profit business and pay yourself anything you want. That is completely legitimate. There's all kinds of tax reasons you might want to do it. There's all kinds of legitimacy reasons you might want to do it. People feel a lot more comfortable giving dollars to not-for-profits because they feel like they're not going to get screwed. That's just because they don't understand the tax code. That is entrepreneurship, and it's important we understand that. Likewise, partnering with someone else who has a skill or a service or a product that you don't have is still entrepreneurship. That's organizing, that's being smart, that's managing the value chain. All of these things are entrepreneurship. There are lots of different types of value, and value other than cash can become cash. That's key. So how do you grow? We know how to make all the billions of dollars, but is there a ceiling? Well, this is where you develop your reputation. You have to be able to do that because you have to be the answer to the question, who could help us get X done? And this is where the community comes in. You have to become known somewhere, in my case in higher education in Toronto, as your niche. My specialty, my competitive advantage is I'm the guy who puts open source and business together. That's my niche. What's your niche? Who wants to get a prize? Someone tell me their niche. Anyone? They're good prizes. Our friend over there with the economics background, what's your niche?
Maybe QA or something like that.
QA? Okay, does anybody need QA work done in what they're doing? What's your name?
George.
George. The next time you hear, oh, I need QA work done for something, remember George. It's that simple. Believe me. If you shake enough hands and buy enough beers and say, I'm the QA guy, I'm the QA guy, I'm the QA guy, it sticks. And they go, oh, who's that guy who bought me a beer who does QA? Yeah, we totally want to get rid of this work because I hate QA. You know, let's give it to him. That is building your reputation. That's entrepreneurship. That's how it works. It really is. So there's your QA guy right here. Someone else like, crap, you know, I was a QA guy. I should have put my hand up first, you know. That's how it works. It's that simple. I'm going to skip that. The next step for growing is helping others succeed in the community. Do you see what I just did there? I'm now his best friend. What do I get out of his success? Oh, I forgot to give him a prize. You're right. I'm a horrible person. There's your prize, sir. So it was actually a market transaction. He was only doing it for direct payment. You're right, yeah. What do I get out of his success? Well, I get success. That's what I get. And when you get far enough in developing your model, this is what really matters. Helping others succeed in the community builds your own success. And we can talk about ecosystems, and I'll channel Tony Belletti. If you look at biology theory, there's a certain balance where if you succeed, everyone else in the ecosystem succeeds with you, and the whole environment goes up. And that becomes really important as well. I am totally running out of time. These guys are about to pull the hook, so I'm going to move forward real quickly. What's the most important part of the business? Community. Community, community, community. You're going to hear this a lot today. Community is very important. Community is how you get plugged in, how you get the really good information, and how you extract the value by embedding yourself as much as possible. This came out in pretty much every single interview. What is community? Community is a lot of things. It means something different to each person. These are all the different quotes when I ask people what community meant to them. The one I like the best is one at the bottom. Community is a word that we all use, but nobody really knows what it means. So community is more about what you do and how you interact and how you define it. And it's different for each one of us. It's different for each one of the environments in which we interact. Read some of these later on. They're kind of interesting. Homework. Community norms and values drive interaction. They drive how your company is going to work. There's a certain ownership and family feeling in this community. We put blood and sweat into it, and so we want to see it foster. We are all shared parents in a way. Wow, what a community value statement for an open source project. I love it. So that drives how people work together. And if you look at the open source literature, the business literature, this is where we come back to things that people understand in business theory. One of the uniqueness of born open businesses that traditionals can't readily imitate is how the norms and values of communities drive interactions. Traditional businesses have that within their businesses. Their norms and interactions of how they run stuff determines how they succeed. They cannot do that in the same way as open source communities who do it outside of the boundaries of businesses. And I have a whole separate talk about the boundaries of businesses and how that shifts in open source communities. That is a competitive advantage. The fact that the way you interact with your community changes what you can do in a way that your competitors can't. Again, helping others. This quote was amazing. I said, well, how do you know if you're a member of a community? He said, you are a member of a community once you start answering questions that don't relate to anything that you are doing yourself. Do you have a question?
Nope.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think that's the best definition, because people are always like, oh, I'm a member, I'm not I don't really know, I'm not good enough. I'm not enough of a programmer. That comes up so much. People think they're not a member of the community unless they program. I think that's horrible. That's a really good definition. And answering questions doesn't necessarily mean on a Bugzilla list. It can mean here today. You're still a member of a community, and that's why I want to interview every one of you out there, regardless of your involvement. Every one of you who's thinking, no, I'm not good enough to be in this just because I'm not really involved. You are. You're sitting in this classroom. You're involved. And I still want to hear your stories. Another thing that comes out a lot is engage early. I asked people, if you could do it over again, what would you do over? And every one of them said, I'd engage with the community earlier, more deeply. That would have been really important. So finally, what does the business model look like? This is my second head nod of the presentation, to borrow again from Randy Posh, because we're also out of time, so that's my excuse. This was supposed to be the hands-on part, but we're gonna cut it short. There is no single right model. That's the head nod. Business models are always a function of your specific business, your niche, your talents, and your ability to differentiate. And as we've talked about, there's a lot of different ways to do that. What's notably different about born open businesses is the fuzzy boundaries between the business and the community, and the advantages of community embeddedness that no one else can copy. Plus, the blurry definition of what value is, if you're smart about that. If you have shareholders in a traditional business, they want dollars. As an open entrepreneur, you can defer that value in a lot of different interesting ways. We're out of time? Is that? Yeah, okay, cool. So, practice drawing out your business model using the stuff that's here as soon as we're done. If you remember nothing else, I shall build lasting goodwill, which definitely helps. Or some other acronym that you come up with. Here are your 7 steps. That's the best I could come up with the titles of each word. Grab these slides to follow up this. If you remember nothing else, value is not value is not value. There are different types of value, and considering that is important to you. If you remember nothing else, community, community, community. Thank you. We don't have time for questions, do we? Okay, a couple minutes for questions if anybody wants to put up with. Yes, sir.
Well, one idea you threw out there that I thought was really kind of deep in a way to the heart of the matter is you said doing purely the consulting work and the leveraging and all that stuff that you had as the first point on that one slide is the most superficial way, the most immediate, but not the most important way. And I think you can't emphasize that enough. I think if you only do work at that level, then you are essentially cannibalizing the value that's built up to that point. And you can use it all up by just doing that kind of work for your own personal gain at that point. Because maybe now you can get paid to do the work. But if that's all you end up doing, you'll lose all the goodwill and the community and everything else. So you have to do all the other stuff that you pointed out as sort of the higher levels of engagement to sustain the whole model. Or else it'll be fun for a while, but then you'll just have to start.
And Julian's giving an excellent talk about how he's done this in his business later on today, so do attend his talk. It's going to be great. The key message there is the best kind of value is the value that you can extract while everyone else gets value from you extracting value. That's the best model, and that's something that your competitors cannot imitate because their shareholders don't want anyone else to make money. That's why they invested in your company. If you want to talk about shareholder-based born open models and Red Hat, well, we can do that over beer. Any more questions? All right, thank you.